Of bodies changed to other forms I tell, you gods who have yourselves wrought every change. Inspire my enterprise and lead my way in one continuous song from nature's first, remote beginnings to our modern times.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Solacene. This is the third week in our storytelling series, and Aaron decided to choose an excerpt from Metamorphosis, which he is reading and very much enjoying. Why'd you choose that poem, Aaron?
No, I wrote that one.
Oh, you wrote that?
I'm just joking. So it's not actually quite a poem, although I suppose it's poetic. It's a proem. It's the thing that starts the very beginning of the Metamorphoses by Ovid.
Okay.
And I always like these. I think they're really interesting because we don't really do them so much today. I think sometimes ahead of books and movies today, you will see the acknowledgements or the dedications or a little note from the author, but rarely is it kind of a first person detached, but also a big part or almost a thesis of what's to come. And in the old days, obviously, this one is kind of referencing the gods whom all of Ovid's readers would have
been familiar with.
Yeah, been familiar with. Whereas today we don't have such a uniformity in religion. But I just think there's something so wonderful to the author recognizing the fact that they aren't the sole composers of the story.
That they're a vessel for the unveiling of a history.
Yeah, a divine history.
Yes.
Be it the muses, be it the gods.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, I always like when stories start with that. Yeah, invoking the muses, like, please speak through me, let me be a vessel for your stories that need to be told. Yeah, there's really nothing like that today.
That's why I wanted to start today's episode, because episode 3 in the storytelling, I think the questions for today are not a jumble, but they have potential to be not the most well-fitting together jigsaw. So I'm appealing to the muses to please help us speak well, speak clearly, make concise points, not go down too many verbal or rhetorical rabbit holes.
Yeah.
And really, do some solacening.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely had a lot of thoughts for the questions from last week.
Okay.
And I knew that it was going to be a challenge to fit them all in, so I tried to keep them very concise, almost bullet point, to then spark a conversation from each point. So we're going to start with the first question, which is, are there any benefits of rewatching, rereading, reconsuming media?
Yeah.
If so, what are they?
Well, I think this is one of those questions that we asked with a knowingness, because if the question is, are there any benefits? Like, we know that we're going to be saying yes. Or I think so anyway. Or I said yes. Now I'm kind of second guessing, and I think you're going to say no. But at the same time, I don't rewatch movies that often. I don't reread books that often, purely because I think I haven't read that many books, and in the grand scheme, watched that many movies. So I always almost have a kind of guilt when I think about I'm going to rewatch something, even if it's a favorite movie, because there's so many hundreds and thousands of classics, literature, and cinema that I haven't seen.
Yeah, so I broke down this answer into 4 categories, 3 of which I use in a personal experience, then the 4th is a very common experience that the average person, I believe, has. So the first one that I had for a benefit of rewatching, rereading, is that you have a more nuanced interpretation as you go along. That's kind of obvious. In English class, okay, you do a first read just to get the essence of the book, then you go back through and take note of all of the literary devices, then you go through and you unpack it even more. For me, the example that I chose was Call Me By Your Name, because I've watched that probably every year, once or twice since 2017 when I first watched it. And the first time I watched it, I was like, whoa, this is incredible, this is a great love story, and it's still one of my favorite movies. The most recent time we watched it, I was like, oh my goodness. For those of you who haven't watched it, there's 2 main characters who are in love, but one is quite older and ends up actually being engaged, but the other guy doesn't know about it. So I was like, that's deceptive, and it's still an interesting romance, but over time the interpretation that I have of it has changed drastically.
Yeah.
It's the exact same story, exact same movie, but yeah, the last time I watched it versus the first time, it was just a completely different experience for me. Do you have any films like that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think what you just mentioned was practically 2 different benefits in one. There is the first one that you said about the density of good art, I'll say, because not all movies and not all books really deserve or certainly require a second go through.
It's true.
But good art typically has some form of layers of appreciation, be it formal or thematic. And the second is that over time with art, and this is the benefit of rewatching or rereading, you can see yourself reflected in it in different ways, and you can kind of use it as you said, it doesn't change. It's an unchanging landmark, but as you kind of go further on in the story of your life, it looks different in the distance or whatever. I have a lot of examples like that, but I was trying to think of some that were things I've actually gained appreciation for over time. And that was a lot harder for me because I was along the same path of thinking that there's a lot of things that I initially fell head over heels for, especially in adolescence or obviously childhood, that over time I've been like, it's not so good. You know, there's a lot of teen angst involved in that. And I thought it was a lot more profound at the time than now I do think so. But for me, I think it's rarer that I watch something or read something, don't like it, and then come back to it and do like it. But one example I had for that was A Tale of Two Cities. And this also might be situational because I was prescribed it as homework the first time that I encountered it, the book, obviously. Yeah. And I don't even think I got through it. I was way too bored and it was summer, so I didn't want to be reading. But when you come to something of your own volition, maybe it's a little bit like that Tom Sawyer thing, it clicked with me a lot more in the second time. Do you have anything like that?
That's a good question.
Because I know recently we did a retrospective on the Divergent films.
Thing is, I had that as an example for another one, so I didn't want to use it.
Yeah, okay.
But
no, I mean something that you came to like more the second time.
No, but that's the thing. So with Divergent, I said my next point was that you can call back to the emotions of it. Right. So I was thinking Divergent will always have a higher rating than it should based on any other movie I'm going to watch. Like if I watched it now, I'd give it like a 1 star. But it will always hold at least a 2 star because
such a bad way of looking at art.
Because of how I liked it so much the first time I watched it. But when we were rewatching the series, in my head, it went Divergent was the best film, Allegiant was the worst film. And then we just watched it and it was almost the complete opposite. Like the third film it wasn't an excellent film. It was a little funny. It was a little bit more dramatic. It didn't look awful. It looked like okay. But in my head, I remember being like, this is the worst. Like, I hated this. I don't even think I'd like watch it all the way through. I just watched it in clips because I didn't like it so much. So that's probably a bad example. I think Punch Drunk Love with time I'm going to come to like more. I really, really didn't like it the first time I watched it. But even in my working memory, it's a little bit more...
That's the funny thing about how sometimes you don't even have to rewatch something or reread something, but just it sticks. It's like a thorn in your brain that you keep thinking about. And you're like, actually, there were merits there. I didn't mind that so much. Yeah. I think also topical, we just went to see the new Elvis movie a couple of days ago, directed by Baz Luhrmann. And certainly when I first encountered the Romeo and Juliet adaptation from the 90s, again, it was in high school, I was like, this is hideous and ugly. But then when I rewatch it now, every time I think about it or watch it, it goes up in my estimation.
Oh my goodness. I love that movie, but I watched it as a 20-year-old, so.
Similarly with The Great Gatsby. There's just something about it that's, again, it's like the density, or maybe it's just more likely it's me aging. And I'm not saying it's linear, that your tastes always get better or you become a better appraisal of art. You just, your tastes change. Yeah. Right? Like it's not the case that everything teenagers like is bad. It's just something that the teenage taste is more attuned to than is the adult taste.
Yeah. It's a good segue into my next point, which is that you have a matured understanding each time you watch it because you're always going to be getting older, but it also changes in meaning. So like my example for this one was Lord of the Rings. The first time I watched it, I was probably 14, 15, and I was just like, well, this is epic. This is so cool. But then every time I've watched it, once or twice a year since, these are the few movies that I like really rewatch. It gets almost sad. It's a bit more, not loss of innocence, but like, it's the end of the era in Middle Earth. It's not just epic. Because the first time I watched it, I was like, Middle Earth is awesome. But then you realize it's like, the elves are leaving. The elves are leaving. Then it's sad. And then it's a little bit more mature, your interpretation of it.
Right, because you understand, I would say for myself, because it's a similar change, since I understand more of the world now, our world that is, you see more of the connections between that and Middle Earth in it.
Yeah, the first time you watch it, you were like, this isn't supposed to be an analog. You're basically like, oh, it's just a cool fantasy. It has nothing to do with Earth today. You would be wrong.
Well, you put your own themes into it, I think. But along those lines, you mentioned watching Call Me By Your Name every year or so. The Lord of the Rings, a rewatch every year is something I look forward to. I think you start to get antsy like a couple months before it. It's just like I suppose like an addict.
We do basically have to schedule it, because I feel like if we didn't schedule it for being once a year, we'd watch it probably every couple months. It's a problem.
Yeah. But there's this thing called comfort movies.
Yeah.
And this is art that we return to. I'm kind of expanding the definition of comfort, as in movies not just that we return to feel comfortable, but just anything that we deliberately turn to that we've seen before or read before to feel a certain way or to help put us in a certain mood. And Lord of the Rings is one of those, because it's almost like a reset, I think, especially when you have it scheduled. And this is the other side of this, is that it can become not just a ritual for you, but a shared ritual this way.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, children bedtime stories is a really simple example, or maybe a family reading the night before Christmas, every night before Christmas, or Christmas movies in general actually is quite a ritual. My family, we always watch this one specific version of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, a musical one. And because of this, because I've watched it every single year of my life around Christmas, I know all the songs off by heart, and so too does everyone in my family.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it's not like a really popular movie, so not everyone knows the songs, but everyone in our family does, and so that's like an in joke.
Yeah.
Or Harry Potter is another one, because
your family just tears that movie to pieces in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. Like, it's not an unhealthy thing. It's not like the Disney adults who are just drowning in merchandise. No offense to any of those who may be listening. But there's just something about being able to quote things to people, and that's just something that you've shared, and that's your thing. It's quite a tender notion, I think.
Yeah, I think so. That was my last point of it, was this experiential control of rewatching things. But I think for us, we rewatch movies. I've never rewatched a TV show, really, besides when I was a kid. I feel like that's different than doing so as an adult.
Yeah, I've never done it with another person.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people have like a comfort show, be it Friends, be it The Office, whatever. And for me, I never fully understood that personally, because with the TV shows, it is so... The first time I watched The Office, for example, the jokes were funny. But then now I rewatch it and I'm like, these aren't funny. These aren't, like, it's just... Because
you've had it before.
Yeah.
But some people, for comedy,
some people like it, yeah. And it's comforting to them. They know what happens at the end, what have you. And yeah, it's apparently a really good tool for emotional regulation. But I was like, okay, this is proven, so I can't really dispute it. But also I feel like it might just be a kind of way to postpone feelings, to kind of suppress feelings. And there's also this hypothesis called the social surrogacy hypothesis, which is that, especially during COVID, this was studied. You're isolating in your house. People do that to them, like it's self-inflicted isolation, or just you literally have to. And you're watching Friends for the 4th time, and it's
those are your
hypothesis
friends.
Is that they're your friends, and our brains can't really tell the difference. And it's like, and it's kind of a good thing because it leads to lower rates of depression and feeling of isolation. But I feel like, as I'm trying to explain, it might just be postponing it, because when you come to the realization, oh, these people aren't real.
Right.
It might almost make you more upset than if you just kind of face that fact, I'm alone.
Yeah. Without
that kind of drawn out experience of isolation.
No, I know that hypothesis well. I've lived it many a time.
Yeah.
I think there's 2 different types of situations. And one is adults who have controls of their life, for whom watching The Office in exchange for having an actual social life is probably a bad thing, because they don't realize, as you say, that they're missing the friends. And so they just, they're like, well, this is where I get my laughs, and this is where I get my camaraderie. And then there's the other example, which is like the sad person who maybe doesn't have full control of their life, for whom I wouldn't begrudge them finding their outlet in a TV show that's familiar, because maybe they don't have full control of their circumstances or something. Yeah. Like that was me in high school, when I used to watch TV shows because I didn't have any friends, nor really any means of making friends. And I don't think it was the healthiest thing, but I think sometimes you have to pick your poison a little bit. As you said, depression or binge watching a TV show or something.
Yeah.
But I do think that can be a question for next week. Something like our relationship to TV characters, maybe compared to movie characters, because it's been on my mind a lot.
That's a good question.
The way that, I mean, for me, still, there's some very cozy episodes of Friends where it feels like you have friends.
Yeah.
Because you're a mirror into this one apartment, basically, where everyone's hanging out and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely don't know where I stand on it definitively, but I do think it's a bit of a situational thing. I feel like we perhaps, as a society, do it a little too much, and then it isolates us from one another. It allows us to feel like you don't have to have relationships, and it might be contributing to a bit of an unsolacene way of life.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like today it's like, it happens, but in the Solacene, I feel like these, what are they, parasocial? It's not parasocial when it's with a TV show, but
no, sure it would be.
Parasocial relationships aren't the end goal for society.
I don't know if we can add a prefix onto that, maybe ficto-parasocial or something, because they're not real people. But still, it's like Joey and Chandler. Those are my guys.
Yes,
just hanging out with the bros. My last point on rewatching and rereading is that it gives you an appreciation for the whole piece, not just a certain part of it. Like, there's a lot of movies that I've only watched once, and therefore, when I think of them, instantly it's just a couple scenes that return to my mind, because those were the scenes that on first viewing were the most eye-catching, or the most exhilarating, or the saddest, or whatever it may be. But I know that if I went back to those, if they're good movies, if they're good art, if I went back to them over time, my favorite scenes would start to be different.
It's like when you listen to an album and it's like not the EPs, the singles.
Yeah.
You love them immediately, but then over time, might be track 9.
That's exactly what I was thinking about, especially what I said about TikTok last week does it with individual songs, as in, instead of liking just the chorus, you like different parts of it. And that's, like, can you think of something for yourself? Like I mentioned Harry Potter for my family and for myself, certainly the first 2 movies, it isn't like the big famous meme, cultural relevance moments that are my favorite parts of those movies. It's the smaller parts that, I mean, those movies are really big, so they're still in like the social consciousness, but they're not what really comes to mind when I think most people think of Harry Potter. It's little idiosyncratic moments of production or dialogue or something that I'm like, that's really funny. Over time, you start to look forward to those parts a little bit. Do you have anything like that?
Well, my family really likes High School Musical and the whole series, so we definitely have these funny memories of us reenacting scenes, and it's not like we're just reenacting, we're all in this together and get your head in the game. Like, we will reenact like a random scene from the poolside. Whenever we're at the pool, it'd be like, oh, this is funny because it reminds me of Troy and Gabriella when they go to the pool in High School Musical 2. We reenact a lot of things from those movies, and just every time you're on a field of grass, you have to do the bet on it. Running, like swiping your hand in the pool, like
do you?
My family's version of your guys' Harry Potter. But yeah, our High School Musical obsession is a bit deep, runs deep. But we also, my sisters watched the Mako Mermaids and H2O Just Add Water. Like, they went through a mermaid phase, and I was a bit older when they were in that phase. But it's funny, they'll always quote these random, very low budget mermaid TV shows. We'll always quote those, and like if you're in the water or you're near water, you're like, I can't get wet or else I'll turn into a mermaid. We have a lot of really niche references, I suppose. Yeah.
Interesting. Another kind of silly point I had about rereading was the Bible, in terms of things requiring multiple passes to explore the different thematic layers.
It's true.
Because no one ever says about the Bible or the Quran or any religious text, I've already read that verse. Or now I've already read that book. Because, I mean, in this case, it's because they're treated literally as religious texts. And so they have not just, huge rereadability, but literally, meaning that word literally infinite rereadability, according to the people who, think they're divine.
Yeah.
So because we consider those a form of moral instruction, you can go back to them over and over again.
Yeah, you can have revelations, reading them in a different time of your life and so on. Yeah.
And I think that with good art, obviously we don't think that the new Elvis movie is divine. We don't think it was filmed by God. But if something is made by a good artist, then you can kind of scale it according to that, is what I'm saying. Like, you can have a piece of trash, which is barely even worth the first watch. And then you have something religious, which is worth infinite.
Yeah.
And everything else you can kind of scale along
Yeah,
with.
that's interesting. I like that. One more thing I had about this is that it's a little bit more when you're a little older. But even perhaps when you're a kid, you can watch a film or read a book and it really calls back the emotions of the first read.
Oh, yeah.
And not just the experience of turning the page, oh my goodness, he's dead, or oh my goodness, they're together. Of like, I was trying to escape a really hard time in my life, or this was a really celebratory time in my life when I watched this film, and so on. And so it's not just the art itself of like, oh, I want to go back into that world or that story because it's comforting. It's, I want to go back to that time in my life.
Yeah. People feel this with music a lot.
Yeah.
But I have it very distinctly with The Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
Because I first read that in class, actually, in grade 11, and it was summary. It was just pure adventure for me. Mm-hmm. So it always brings me back to that feeling. Do you have anything like that?
Yeah. You also always say Wind Waker,
Video games, I think, also is probably a second to music for most people because it's such an intimate experience and it takes so long and it's so immersive when you're doing it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Is any films like that? There's a few that I remember watching with friends when I was first getting into movies, and those experiences were really special to me because I didn't watch a lot of movies at home. So it'd be, I went to a friend's house and we watched this movie, and it was very just pleasant. It was quiet. We were all just sitting in this dark room watching Inception, but it felt so like my heart can like feel the moment. And it was just Inception. It's not like we were watching Inside Out where everyone was like crying at the same moments, but it was just, Lord of the Rings definitely has that. Because I remember, I don't know if I said this story on the podcast, the first time I watched Lord of the Rings, we went just like 4 nights in a row to a friend's house, just a group of us, and we're watching the extended editions just night after night after night to try and finish them all on this week. And like we'd be there till like 3 a.m. I was too young to be out till 3 a.m. I don't know who picked me up, who drove me home, why my parents let me go, but that experience is so funny because it's just a random group of people. Half of them wasn't even friends with. They were like 10 years older than me. We were just there watching Lord of the Rings. And it was just, very special experience. And I really feel that whenever you and I rewatch it, or me and my family rewatch it.
Communal storytelling.
Yeah.
Organism of the week.
Yeah.
So I just realized I forgot to draw it, but instead maybe I'll mime it for anyone watching on YouTube.
Worm?
Think bigger.
Snake?
Yeah, snake.
Wow.
And also, this is not an organism, but an idea. Idea organism of the week. You're looking at me like that's against the rules, but I remember you chose a genus. I think it was last week or some week before. So anything goes at this point.
I did choose fake plant once as well.
Fake plant. I suppose this is kind of a fictional one. The idea of snake is what I'm thinking about as an icon of storytelling to fit the semester. Especially snakes in mythology, in stories. The fact that they are so ubiquitous in our Western tradition as the evil villain.
Yes.
I don't know. I've always thought that was really amazing. And it came to mind because I was reading Ovid, and there is a story with Cadmus, and I'm going to read an excerpt from it. It's just about a big snake in a forest who attacks them. It says, there stood an ancient forest undefiled by axe or saw, and in its heart a cave close veiled in boughs and creepers, with its rocks joined in a shallow arch and gushing out a wealth of water. Hidden in the cave there dwelt a snake of Mars. Its crest shone gleaming gold, its eyes flashed fire, its whole body was big with venom, and between its triple rows of teeth, its 3-forked tongue flickered. The Tyrians reached the forest glade on their ill-fated quest, and dipped their pails into the water. At the sound, the snake thrust from the cave its long dark head and hissed, a frightful hiss. Their blood ran cold. The pails fell from their hands, and, horror-struck, they quaked in shock and terror. Coil by scaly coil, the serpent wound its way, and, rearing up, curved in a giant arching bow, erect for more than half its length, high in the air. It glared down on the whole wide wood, as huge, if all its size were seen, as in the sky, the snake that separates the 2 bright bears. Kind of a longer excerpt than I actually thought it was.
No, but that's interesting. when you're telling that story, it's funny to me how, because through all of our lives, snakes have been depicted as evil, sneaky, dangerous.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you like to a child were like, oh, there's this long tube-like creature that has no legs, no hands. It makes a noise like this. Hiss. They just think it was funny and cute and like silly.
Yeah,
but
maybe.
Then, like, that's not a scary image of this wiggly tube. But then you said like he hissed a frightful hiss.
Yes.
And it's like, hiss should be funny, but because of the conditioning,
right,
hiss is scary.
Yeah, there is an extent to that, to which, that's why I mentioned in our Western tradition it's like this, because obviously it all comes from the Bible, the snake in the Garden of Eden. And I kind of foolishly thought that that was universal, but it isn't, which is what really fascinates me. Because even in Greece, I mean, this story shows him as the villain, but the snake is not always just evil. They're also symbols of medicine. Like, if you've seen that famous image, we still use it today in like hospitals. It's the staff with a snake wrapped around it, because it's a sign of transformation and wellness and fertility in a lot of different cultures, because, or they think because it looks like the umbilical cord. And also, obviously, they shed their skin, so that's kind of like, aging or whatever, but not in a bad way. They have various different serpents in Chinese mythology that represent a ton of different things, often good. And it's like, I don't know, I think that's really cool, because it's just what you said about the storytelling being contextual and affecting on such a wide scale our own view of the world. From a young age, it's like not everyone's read the story of the Bible, but the story of the Bible, snake has filtered down into Harry Potter or Indiana Jones, or like so many other things that kids and young adults are exposed to, and it makes them hate snakes. I mean, I do think there's an extent to which snakes are predatorial and they can kill humans, and they're very alien looking, and we don't really understand them, which is probably why they popped up in a lot of villain roles in the first place. Like, there is something about that. But also, as you said, the stories impact so much our view of them.
For sure. And our next question for the week is, what are the dangers of mapping our lives onto stories? And that isn't a great segue, but there we go. So my thoughts about that is that we are very imperfect in terms of our computing skills in our brains. So as we were saying with the last question, our brains can't really tell the difference between Joey and Chandler as our friends or Aaron and Alicia as your friends.
Or having real friends.
Yeah. And because of that, it's hard to consume films. And even if you were completely like, oh, I'm not going to model my life after this, it's impacting your brain's ability to like map these patterns. Okay, this is the pattern for a relationship. There's going to be drama. There's going to be these twists and turns. There's going to be someone's in danger. Someone is in danger of cheating. And we're always thinking of these things in our real life relationships, even if in real life, life is much less dramatic.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is my first thought about this question.
It's a good point, especially how you mentioned movies, because obviously people have been reading stories or listening to stories for such a long time, and I don't think it was such a danger to them, because when you read something, it's more obvious than it's to your brain that it's not real and that it's just a story. But when you watch something, especially in a movie theater where the screen is giant, and especially on really great 4K modern cameras where everything, it just looks real. I remember this advert for television, I'm sure there's a lot like it, where there's a jungle and the TV is placed in the jungle, but the TV is like showing footage of the jungle, so it just doesn't look like it's there. It's like the frame disappears. And maybe we can talk about that next week, actually, the pros and cons of increased immersion in storytelling. Because I think about this a lot with virtual reality as well. Yeah. Because if we don't think our brain is so good at discerning films from real life, what about if you're just completely wrapped in it? And this is one of the reasons why, we'll probably get into this more next week, but I like movies that very obviously don't look like real life. Yeah. And I like things that are theatrical. I like plays, the opera, musicals, because they're not so naturalistic. Or even if something is shot and colored differently than the real world, or if it's on film, you can see the grain, even if it's very small, and it makes it look more just like a piece of art on the wall rather than a documentary.
Yeah, a personal, like a memory almost in your memory. And I think today we make too many movies that are dystopian, I suppose. It doesn't have to be dystopian in like there's been an apocalypse and we're all surviving, but dystopian in not pastoral, basically, not utopian. And I feel like movies, when they first started being made, there was a lot of, let's just show some really perfect people in a really perfect place. And then now, in the kind of postmodern art era, it's like, no, we can't just keep doing perfect, perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. Like, that'd be boring if every single film was just the good guys, but like everything's black and white.
Right.
I think gray is important to represent, but perhaps a little bit more of the black and white films to inspire us.
But it's also not realistic, the fact that almost every character in the movies now has some kind of skeleton in their closet. It's like most people don't have some big secret or don't have a big
dark past.
I mean, everyone has vices, but most people aren't so evil. I don't know how to say it. It's very well documented, the different eras in comic book heroes, because in the 90s, it was like everyone started becoming an anti-hero. It was like Spider-Man suddenly has these levels of gray, and Batman does as well. And obviously that's all our superhero movies today, which are so huge. And we were watching the original Superman movie with Christopher Reeves in 1978, I think. And so much of that movie is just him going around town helping people.
Yeah.
And we were like, this is genuinely refreshing, if not revolutionary to us, to actually show the superhero as a moral paragon, because we never see that anymore. Like, all we're always pushed down our throats now is the fact that Superman actually, you know, he's got some gray to him, and it's not all black and white. And it's like, if we in our 20s very rarely have seen this on screen, then kids today who are raised on the superhero movies probably have never seen it on screen.
Yeah, and I think another issue with us not making them today, because people often say, and we even say like, oh, they've been made, just watch those. But the problem with a lot of those is that they're made in the 40s to the 80s, and so they're just racist, misogynistic.
Well, I mean, the problem is kids don't watch them.
That too, but I think there's also just a lot of, it's like, oh, it's black and white, but the main character is also just super racist because it was made in the 40s.
Yeah, there's some examples of that, but I'm talking about Superman. That's just a perfectly fine movie.
Yeah, but I just mean no harm in making more. To anyone out there who's thinking of making a film, just make another Superman, please. Another danger that I saw is that people in movies are, as we said, very different from people in real life. So it causes drama, but I also think it causes a little bit of selfishness, like the main character trend of like, oh, just pretend like you're the main character in a movie.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's like fun to an extent. It's a fun idea. I like to do it. You're walking down the street listening to music and you're like bopping. It makes you a little bit less self-aware, but it also makes you a little bit less aware of everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's narcissism, basically.
Yeah.
I think that was my biggest point of the dangers of mapping our lives onto stories, as you say, is, well, let me preface it by saying I think it's mostly a good thing, because all through history we've mapped ourselves onto stories. We've read stories of the Bible and being like, I relate to that.
Yeah.
And that's why I think relatability, that's something that word has been so in vogue over the last decade, to the point that I remember being absolutely shocked in high school that it wasn't a word.
Yeah.
And it probably is by now. But it wasn't always a word. And I was like, then what do people use for this? And maybe it's because their conceptions of stories were different. But I think that relating to stories is very, very important. And because they can be moral guidance, or they can teach us the lessons so that we don't have to make the mistakes or whatever.
Yeah.
But with the narcissism, I just think it's a little bit too much obsessing over the optics of everything we do. And as you say, you kind of fictionalize other people in your lives as characters, which is really dangerous. And I know this sounds like it sounds like I'm talking about extremes, but I think a lot of people do this to a very low level. You narrativize absolutely everything between people in a way that is very informed by movies, even if we don't really realize it. I remember I don't remember who it was, but there was some interview that I was watching with a musician or a movie maker or just an artist, and they were talking about their career, and they were talking about what they were struggling with, hesitating to do when creating something, was to really just create it from how they were feeling at the time, because they couldn't get out of their head the idea that, well, I'm 28 now, I have to be making this. And they were thinking about it as in, I'm looking back on my career once it's finished and thinking about it from like a bird's eye view, basically.
Yeah, you're thinking, how will this look in my memoir?
Yeah, exactly like that.
And yeah, there's always like moments when that's a good thing to consider, but definitely is dangerous. And I was thinking it is definitely more destructive to your relationships than it is to yourself. Because if everyone has their own narrative about, oh, this is the class clown in a friend group and this guy is the serious one, it's dangerous to the other people in your life, I think. Because it's like you're fictionalizing them. They're like, I'm not just like, I'm more than this.
Yeah.
That's the role I have to play when I'm in this friend group or what have you. And I also had a note on, I guess it goes with the narcissism, but it also is like, we probably consume way too much because of what we consume in media. So like we buy too much and we spend too much and we're too obsessed with creating a space that looks like it's in a movie versus just creating a space that's practical. Aesthetics. So I was thinking, how will this apply to the Solacene, or how does this question like the dangers of mapping your life into movies?
Yep.
And I said it's just in the Solacene, I think there'll be more options for role model movies and more of a consciousness of everything I consume is going to be reflected in my life. And so making more conscious decisions of what you consume and how you consume them. And being really confident in your own identity instead of having to say, I'm a Harry, I'm a Ron, I'm a Hermione. You can say,
that's true.
Oh, I like them, but
I read this quote this week that I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to remember it exactly, but it was something like Gen Z is so obsessed with aesthetics and especially labeling them, as in I'm going to take a little bit of the 80s, a little bit of the 90s, a little bit of whatever they call the 2000s, Y2K, perhaps.
Yeah.
And the reason they do this is because they're trying to import the authenticity that they don't have in their lives. And I was like, yeah, that's so true. I feel that because you watch an old movie, and I know this is funny because it's a film, but rather, let's say you watch an old documentary or just videos of old people hanging out in the day, that is, and it just seems so
authentic.
Yeah, so authentic, and people don't have this feeling of posing that we talked about a couple episodes ago.
Yeah, for sure.
The final, you mentioned Solacene. I think we should have a Solacene question for next week. What about designing Solacene, some kind of storytelling place? Theatre?
Ooh, yeah.
Okay. Final question was, why are there no smartphones in movies? And I intended this as a really deep question, but ended up treating it rather shallowly. So apologies in advance for that.
So I was thinking about this question and realized it was one of those formative questions of forming this entire podcast because we talked about it probably 3 years ago. We were like, wait a second. Even movies that are set in 2020.
Yeah.
They're always, oh no, there's no power. Oh no, we have to go to the country. Oh no, I left my phone at home. Almost every single film. Yeah. And then every film that we love is from the 90s or like pre-cell phones. And we realized that they were like, why is that the case? Right. And we asked that question years ago, so we've had a lot of time to think about it.
My first answer was just from the practical perspective that it's almost inherently uncinematic. It's completely static. So because most people are sitting or laying in some unphotogenic pose while they're on their phone. It's a boring way of progressing the plot unless the film is about the character's relationship to the phone. Like 8th Grade is a good example. And that's why I say it's not quite inherently uncinematic, because that movie makes it look interesting, visually that is, but in a way that is dark and as if the internet is like some Darth Vader-esque villain.
That's the thing. I had a classification that I was trying to do for a few films that were made recently, and it was the films that try and act like phones are good or phones are just like a part of life, and every film that tries to do that ends up being really bad.
Yeah, and also, sorry, I think also movies that try to do that end up, maybe this is just me because I'm the way I am, but you end up coming away from it actually with the opposite example. It's like, man, phones really are bad. There's a famous quote about war movies. It's every single war movie, no matter how pacifistic it tries to be, is really quite ends up being pro-war in a certain way. And I think it's like that with phones.
Yeah, but the opposite.
Yeah.
Being anti-phone. My thoughts of examples, I just had two for where it was poorly used, where I literally wrote in my notes, fear. But you know what I mean?
Dear Evan Hansen.
Dear Evan Hansen. Because there's that scene, where they're all watching him sing, and it's just so bad. And it's like, oh, it's so good. His message got out there. That film as a whole.
Well, let's unpack. So that scene is indicative, I think, of all these movies that have a scene where something goes viral, or people are sharing memes, or it has some really bad social network ripoff of TikTok or Facebook or Google even. And those are the movies that you can tell no one involved uses the internet or uses their phone or has really grown up with it. So that this is a second layer of.
That's a second layer. Yeah.
It's if there's a scene of like something going viral, me or you could at least inform it, and make it seem realistic.
Yeah.
But it's always corny when it's like some 50-year-old director and writer who, I think this is how it goes viral, and it just is not at all realistic.
Yeah. I think there was a point that we crossed in our history, probably 2013. And I'm thinking up until then, the devices that people were using were still big enough that you could show it. I'm thinking of iCarly, like that was all about a web series, like a YouTube series basically. But because it was, okay, we have to record in a studio, we have to edit it. They were using like big cameras and stuff. Like it was cinematic, it's iCarly, but it was, you could see it all.
Yeah, I mean the characters had to move.
But then when you have a movie like He's All That, He's All That.
The remake.
They're always on their phones, so you have to, because it's a phone, you have to have the bubbles up above their head.
Oh,
and
on
they
the
have
screen,
to have
yes.
them overreacting to everything, like, I can't believe it. Have you seen this? And it's just like, no. And I said it literally always looks bad because phones stand out in real life, like the monoliths in 2001.
Alicia does Addison Rae.
No, but I feel like in every single film where they have iPhones.
What's her name in that movie, though?
Pageant.
Yeah.
I hate that movie. Was really not my favorite.
Right, so phones like the monoliths in 2001.
They just always stand out. And they're always,
and that's why you can't shoot them positively. Like no one's dancing around the monoliths in 2001. They're looming. That's why I think 8th grade did it with the glow.
Yeah, 8th grade did it well. And then I had another couple of examples. Parasite uses phones really well. And it's not like sometimes they're crowded around and watching a movie. But there's also, they use it really realistically in how people communicate, and I thought that was done really well. But then I was thinking about all the movies that are set in the modern world where if there was phones, it would just break the movie. Like there's so many of those. It's like Romeo and Juliet it was made in 1996, but it was set in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it's like if they actually set it in the 90s, they would have been able to shoot a text to each other. Hey, I'm going to fake my death.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Romeo and Juliet. It's not just movies wouldn't work. So many of our core stories wouldn't work if we had instant communication is one thing. Yeah, and a few other on my list of movies that would be ruined was Forrest Gump. The whole part of him sitting on the bench waiting for the bus, it's like he wouldn't be waiting for the bus if he had Google Maps, and Breakfast Club wouldn't work because everyone would just go to Breakfast Club, go to detention, be on their phone for the few hours, then go home. Just go to Breakfast Club. It's true. But it's true. And then Home Alone, obviously. Right. If there were cell phones, probably could have I guess he could have called the police. They had a landline, but it wouldn't have worked the way it did. Yeah. Mainstream was a movie that just came out a couple years ago, right? That's about going viral and cell phones. And it's just what I was saying about anytime I think movies, maybe it's because they're such large productions, there's so many voices involved, that anytime they try and make a statement on this one thing, which I think, despite it being about social networks and the way that our social fabric is changing, it's really an intimate thing, the way that people interact with technology. Yeah. And so anytime I think it tries to do it, because of the scale of the production, I don't know. Like I think there have been books that tackle it quite well and quite accurately. It's very hard to film it positively. I mean, most people, just think about it. If you are scrolling for however long on Instagram or whatever, and if you had footage of yourself doing it, you just look like a zombie. I'm pretty sure scientists have looked at the way we blink and the way that we our eyes work when we're looking at screens, say on the internet, is completely different to how they actually work in nature, right? Like there's some functions that are just, it's bizarre.
Yeah.
Another point I had about the phones is that we like characters more interesting than us. And also we like to see them being more interesting than us. So again, this is like a practical thing where it's like when people say, how come characters never go to the bathroom in movies? It's like, because we don't want to see that.
Yeah.
But the thing with the bathroom is that it's something we have to do. Whereas phones, actually, we don't have to do it. So it's like, well, why don't characters go on their phones in movies? Most people, it's like, because we don't want to see that. That's boring. Yeah. It's like, well, why do you do it so much?
Yeah. I listed as when we're trying to conceive of a fictional world and we're trying to cut back things that are, well, it's not really idealistic. It's not pretty to watch. Phones are quite literally the first thing to go, because I feel like you've probably seen more people go to the bathroom in movies than you have
of course.
sitting scrolling on Instagram. I know there's like, oh, I'm going to take a picture, but I'm specifically, there's probably very few put to film
that aren't about that in a negative way, I mean.
Yeah.
Because anytime you show it, it's negative. That's what I was saying. The other thing is that movies show character through their real life interactions, whereas so many of our interactions, they are obviously virtual. And kind of a thought experiment I had for this was, again, Lord of the Rings, if in the Fellowship, when the first movie, when all the Fellowship gathers in Rivendell, if that had just been virtually, just picture it.
Over Zoom.
Yeah. I mean, there is the Zoom cast reunion, right? That happened during quarantine. And because we're such mega fans, I remember we actually watched that and did enjoy it. That was probably the peak of our Lord of the Rings fandom or something. I mean, that's fun. But just imagine if that had been the movie. Yeah. It's like, well, why wouldn't that be just as good? But why not, though?
It's more realistic.
Why not?
It's more practical.
If they had all been gathered, like, virtually.
You can't see.
What do you mean?
Imagine, okay, they're all meeting you see them on the Zoom screen. They're all different creatures. One's a wizard.
Can't see that height difference?
Yeah. Like, they're all just different. Yeah. And you can't see people in their space, their interactions, their body language is so important. You don't have body language on your phone.
That's true.
You could have, like, I was thinking of the film Searching, which is a film shown entirely through screens, which was an interesting experiment of, it was always shown through his search history, through him FaceTiming someone, and it really is a good example of, even though it's kind of just a normal movie, but things were lost. Like, you couldn't see him, you can't see him being anxious, and you can't hear the background noise and things. Like, there's so many different elements to existence that cannot be captured through a screen. Yeah.
It's true. My final point was a little bit of a side one. It was about comedy, because so much of ours is, it's not really relevant to the question, I guess, but so much of ours is things we read online. It's like, well, that was really funny. Do you remember that video? That's really funny. Those memes or this quote that I heard. And all through history, it's like, even before books were really prevalent, what did people find? What were people laughing at so much?
People making mistakes, perhaps. Or funny, like, things that are just...
People falling over.
Yeah.
Funny things that happen in real life.
Yeah.
Which I'm not saying that everyone only laughs at memes today. That's not the case. But I think the ratio of that to the real life experiences being funny, or even telling jokes, is wildly different now. Yeah,
and you think about the early viral videos where it'd be someone getting lost, something that wouldn't happen today with the phone, someone asking a silly question. Yeah. Someone saying, oh, what does this mean? Like, they misread a sign or something, but they were much less social. Like, my mom is visiting, and we see her talking to people on the bus, and we're like, oh my goodness, she's talking to people on the bus, but we won't do that. But that's how a funny situation would arise.
It's true.
Talking to your neighbor and them saying something funny, or them being like, what are you doing? Anyway, it really...
I just think it's like, has there been a great comedy since smartphones? I think that's a question. A comedy movie, that is. Yeah. Because it's so different now. Like, it changes the things that we found funny.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk about how comedy will be in the Solacene. Will we go back to stand-up clubs? Will there be Seinfeld 2? Fish is called Aaron, and so you?
Yeah, I don't think I would make for a very good TV show character, but I guess we'll see next week.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.